let me know in just in the comment box. I hope that, yes, great. So good afternoon. My name is Nenad Matej. I work as a regional project manager here at the Terre regional office for Europe. We're based in Budapest, Hungary. And I'm also a manager of the Bridge project, which is short for Building Relationships Through Innovative Development of Gender-Based Awareness, Gender-Based Violence Awareness in Europe. So this is a regional project that we are coordinating here from the Terre regional office, but working in partnership with Defense for Children International in Belgium and Fedasil in Belgium, NGO ARSIS in Greece, the NGO Kopin in Malta, and Terre Romania. The Bridge project is supported by the European Union's Rights, Equality and Citizenship Program 2014-2020, and we are working or have the objective with this project to strengthen the statutory response to gender-based violence, which is affecting children and youth on the move in EU countries. As part of the Bridge project, we are organizing a series of webinars on this topic of gender-based violence and migration to share practices and interesting practices, good practices that exist elsewhere in Europe. And the purpose of this webinar specifically is to present the training curricula that we have developed as part of the Bridge project and to present how you could best utilize them. The training curricula that we have developed as part of the Bridge project is composed of a training manual for care professionals. There is also a manual for youth facilitators and an e-learning course on gender-based violence. I would like to share now from my screen so that you can see where exactly these project outputs are available. If you go to the Child Protection Hub platform, we have a dedicated page to the Bridge project. If you go to the section of Find Out More Projects, there is a section on Bridge, a special section on Bridge, where we are posting news items, updates that come from the project, all of the project outputs. So here we have at the bottom a library where we are posting, where we have posted the training manual, a youth facilitator manual. If you go to the link, you will be able to retrieve the English version, but not only the English version, we have also made them available in the local languages from the project countries, namely Dutch, Greek, Romanian, and French. In order to access the e-learning course on gender-based violence, one would need to go to the Child Hub Academy on the platform, where a list of courses is also available on other thematics. Specifically, the one for the Bridge project is classified or categorized according to language versions, and we here have the gender-based violence English version, as you can see. In order to access the course, you would need to have a registration or to be registered on Child Hub. I would now like to introduce the speaker for today's webinar, Ms. Karen Abbs, who is a gender-based violence and learning and development specialist with whom we've had the great pleasure to work with as part of the project. So Karen, I would hereby like to give you the floor.
Wonderful, thank you. And
Thank
I'm just
you.
going to start all of my my devices here. Wonderful. Can everyone hear me as well? You can just put a chat in the box that you can hear me. Fantastic, brilliant. Well, it's such a pleasure to be with those of you who signed in today, and for those of you who are going to be listening to the recording, welcome as well. And then thank you so much for the introduction, Anand. And as you said, I'm a gender-based violence specialist, and I've really had the pleasure working with Terre on the Bridge project and on putting together these training materials. And we were able to deliver the first set of training of trainers with the project and with the group just last week in Budapest. And it is really such a beautiful, amazing project that's being developed around putting out training materials, testing them, and then delivering down to other care professionals. So fantastic materials, fantastic project. And what I'm going to be doing is taking you through what's exactly in these materials so you can have a sense of what might be helpful for you, what you might be able to use, and what might be more interesting to you. Now, as we go through, please, if you have any questions, type them into the chat box. I'm really happy to answer questions as we go along or answer any at the end as well. And so the first thing that we're going to do is just a small poll. The question is, have any of you already downloaded these training materials? So there's just a poll up. So if you could answer yes or no to that. So a couple of you have. Brilliant. Fantastic. So a few of you have already been looking at the training materials, and a few of you are probably just exploring them. And now that you know how to access them, you'll be able to pull those up. Brilliant. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you step by step through each of the training materials. So we have an online training, and we have a facilitator manual for rolling out the GBV training program to other care professionals, and we also have a youth facilitator manual. So I'm going to be taking you through the content of each of these sets of materials just so you can have a greater awareness of what's in them and also how you can utilize them. So the first one I'm going to focus on is the online training. And this is just a screen capture from part of the online training. And you'll see the quote that we put up is, just one adult caring about a child affected by GBV can make a significant difference in their lives. And so the reason why this course in particular has been put together, it's been designed for professionals who come into contact with children and youth on the move. So it's to give information to people who may not have a background in gender-based violence, but maybe contact with children and youth on the move. My own particular experience with children and youth on the move and with gender-based violence comes from, I started working in Canada about 20 years ago, which is where I come from originally. And I was working in gender-based violence in Canada with children and youth. And then I went abroad to work mostly in refugee camps. And so for the past 15 years, I've been working with children and youth on the other side of Europe, hoping to get to Europe, coming from refugee camps. One specific one I've been working in is in Ethiopia with quite a few Eritrean youth, hoping to make the journey onto Europe. So the beauty of these materials is seeing support being put into place for the children who've moved and the youth who've moved. And if you're living in a refugee camp in other parts of the world and really hoping to make this migration into Europe and then moving around Europe, sometimes they're not sure about the services that they could receive, about the supports that they could receive, and have high levels of vulnerability potentially to gender-based violence. So these materials are really focused on building capacity of people who may not have in the past had so much exposure to children and youth on the move or exposure to gender-based violence. Depending on social care backgrounds, they may have had quite a bit of experience working with street children or children living in poverty, but this is quite a new topic that we're facing around looking at trauma histories, how children and youth are migrating and on the move, and then adding in the component of gender-based violence. So through the training, we're really hoping to develop the skills and awareness of how to best support children and youth on the move who may have been exposed to or impacted by GBV. Some have been exposed to and impacted before they started their journey, so either in their home country or in the camps or while on the journey that they've made to get into Europe, or they may be exposed to GBV once they arrive in the country that you're currently working in. So the goal of these materials is really on building awareness and building capacity to respond to the children in the best way possible and the youth in the best way possible. So as you go into the course, you'll be asked to download a gender-based violence workbook. So this workbook forms your action planning. So what we're hoping will come out of the course is you're going to achieve your learning through information will be presented. So you'll receive some information on some of the background of the children that you might be coming into contact with, a bit of information on children and youth on the move at the moment, the data, the statistics. So you'll be taken through a series of pieces of information. Then you'll do learning through case studies. Then you'll be asked to do reflection in the workbook that you've downloaded, and then to take action. So the final part of the course really is around what action are you going to take as a result of doing this training. And you'll be asked at the end around a series of commitments that you commit to recognizing the signs of GBV. So you'll be taken through information on understanding and recognizing the signs of GBV. You commit to being prepared if and when a child reports to you. So a component of the training is on how to manage a disclosure if a child reports information to you. And then the final commitment is on preventing GBV through child safeguarding. So you'll be taken through information on prevention, and being asked to build through the document that you'll download is your action plan around how are you going to work with, respond, and hopefully prevent GBV from happening with children and youth on the move. So that course, it takes about an hour to complete it, and gives you the first set of skills really around children and youth on the move and on gender-based violence. So that's a really good starting platform. So I would recommend that's your first place to start. Do the online training. And then the next level is for delivery of information. So it's a training manual. It's very practical. So this is the training manual. It's GBV affecting children and youth on the move. So this is a training manual that you can download, and it takes you step by step through a 2-day training program that you can run and deliver for other care professionals. So I'm going to take you through the manual now and just let you know what's in it, what the modules are, and what you can expect from the manual. So what you'll find in the manual is a complete introduction and course background. It will take you through the course objectives. There is a training and preparation checklist. So if you imagine this manual is a wonderful a recipe book of how to deliver this training, and it includes all aspects of the training. So what materials and supplies do you need to have in place? What checklist do you need to fill in beforehand? Talks about local adaptations. So suggested activities in the manual, but you may need to adapt it locally depending on the culture and the context where you're working. So there's some suggestions around local adaptations. There's information on energizers, and suggesting that you have participants develop the energizers if you feel that's appropriate. And then information on how to do evaluation and on end of the day reflections. And there is also, of course, all of the training materials that are in the document. So there's 2 days of training materials. The first day focuses on an introduction to the topic, and then really moving on through GBV children and youth on the move. And I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail. So this just gives you a highlight of what we might be looking at. We'll be looking at child protection and safeguarding, signs and impact of GBV, and then GBV prevention, mitigating risk, and action planning. So that's on the first day. So I'm just going to run you through each of these modules in a bit more detail. And so the meat of this starts with really module 2, where we're looking at GBV in children and youth on the move. So module 2 takes you through some of the data, some of the statistics, and a real awareness and understanding of what is gender-based violence, what is gender, why are children and youth on the move more vulnerable, and just some information and statistics on where the children and youth might be coming from and how they're moving through Europe. So again, we focus on who are the children, and there's some stories built into the training manuals around some of the background and stories. And you may be facing some of the children and youth on the move and have your own stories that you can share, but there's some suggested stories in the manual. And then we look at why are children and youth on the move. So what's causing the children and youth to move, either with families or and being accompanied. So what's causing them to move? So there's a lot of information on that. And then we really go into what is gender-based violence. So giving a very good mapping and understanding of what is GBV, what are some of the circumstances that increase vulnerability, looking at risk, and just some very good exercises and awareness materials on that. Then Module 3 looks at child protection and safeguarding. So we map out what exactly is child protection and what is safeguarding, and how can you, through your programming, achieve child safeguarding. And what I really want to outline, if you have already looked at the manuals, you'll have seen it, but if you haven't, the manuals really are step by step, deliver all the instructions around how you would deliver these modules. So all of the information is there, and of course you can make adaptations as needed. So Module 4 on the first day is looking at the signs and the consequences of GBV. So what are some of the signs that you might see in children and youth if they're experiencing GBV, and what are some of the impacts? So how does GBV impact the life of a child or the life of a youth? And Module 4 will take you through some exercises on this. And part of that module is really looking at who is most at risk. So how do you define who is most at risk? And there's some mapping work that you can do with that module around identifying types of situations that create higher risk than others. So for example, a young teenage girl traveling by herself would be highly vulnerable and more at risk for gender-based violence than perhaps a teenage boy traveling with his whole family. So it helps you to begin to look at, when you come into contact with children and youth on the move, being able to do a bit of a triage if there's a large group that you're faced with around who is potentially most at risk and how do you identify vulnerability. Then we'll look at GBV warning signs. So some of the warning signs, if you're working with children and youth over a long period of time, you may see some changes in behavior. You may see, especially if girls or boys are on their own, traveling unaccompanied, and you notice they're not appearing well, they're unkept, and you start to wonder what might be happening for them. This section just takes you through what are some of the potential warning signs that you might see. Then we'll be looking at what is the impact of gender-based violence. So impacts can, have a wide range of devastation for a child or youth who's survived gender-based violence. And this module just takes you through some of the impacts of that on their life going forward, but also begins to look at resilience. So youth and children carry resilience with them. And so we begin to bring that in as well, looking at strength-based and resilience. And so again, looking at this little boy, even though he's a child and youth on the move, if you look at his face, he has such strong determination in there. And he's like, I'm going forward, I'm moving, and it's capitalizing on that strength that you might find in a child or a youth and the resilience that they're carrying with them. And the key focus really is that all of this is survivor-centered. So by survivor-centered, it means taking the best interests of the child and youth involved, looking at their safety, looking at their needs, looking at their wishes. In some countries you're working and you may have mandatory reporting around gender-based violence, but the focus really should be on a survivor-centered model, that we always keep the best interests of the child or youth at the heart of everything that we do. So then the final few modules on day 1, so we begin to move from an awareness and an understanding of gender-based violence, how it impacts children and youth, to looking at, well, how do we potentially prevent it and how do we assess risk? So we're building on a socio-ecological model with the child and youth is at the center. And what we want to understand is what is their risk, what is their vulnerability, also what is their resilience, so we can begin to build on the resilience. And we start to do some mapping. So if we look at family and peers, what is the risk? What is the resilience? If we look at the community, the same questions, and then the society at large. So some of you may work at kind of much higher levels in your community or country and have influencing over policy. So you can look as well, like in the society that you're working in, what are some of the risks, but also what are some of the strengths and the resilience that you can offer to children and youth on the move. So through the training, you'll be taken through a mapping of your context where you'll be asked a series of questions around the services available, the risks, the strengths, a real mapping so you can have an in-depth understanding of where you're working. And so there's a series of questions that you'll be taken through in order to map the context. And from there, you'll be looking at mitigating risks. So after you've potentially identified some of the risks that children and youth in your area are facing, so for example, potentially there is a lack of safe spaces where children and youth can come together, where they are potentially able to disclose GBV if they wanted to talk about it, and you identify there's a lack of safe spaces. We need to put something into place. So this is where you're going to come up with an action plan around how to mitigate the risk. So what are some things that we can do? And so by the end of the first day, you'll have developed an action plan around what you can practically do in the area that you're working in to look at risk and to mitigate it. So the first day really focuses on awareness, on identification, understanding where you're working, mapping everything out, and then creating an action plan. So the goal of all of these materials is that you leave with something tangible, that you feel you've attended a training, you've gained some awareness, but also you're leaving with a plan around what you're going to do next. So after that, the next day then focuses much more on responding to GBV. So if a child or youth discloses an incident of GBV to you, how do you respond to that? What do you do about it? And very importantly, how do you look after yourself? Working with children who are telling you difficult stories or have had difficult experiences can be extremely stressful for you, and you potentially experience vicarious or secondary trauma. So the first module on the second day really focuses on responding to gender-based violence. So what are some tools and strategies that you can use when you're responding to children and youth? How do you talk to them in an effective way about gender-based violence? And there's also a strong focus on working across culture, as most likely many of the children and youth you're coming into contact with have a different language from you, a different cultural background. You may be working through interpreters. So there's a section of the training that focuses on, well, how do we respond to gender-based violence across a different culture as well? And how do you have a disclosure when you're working through an interpreter? How do you do that effectively and with compassion and support and empathy? So after we look at kind of the tools for responding, we begin to look at case management. Case management for children and youth on the move can be a bit tricky. And part of the reason for that is because the children are often moving across country, sometimes very, very quickly. So the case management section looks at within your own country, your own community, and it gives some strategies for doing case management. Some of you may already be doing that with other organizations and other services for children and youth, but it just gives some suggestions for case management and then some discussion about case management across countries. At the moment, there's very little in place around being able to manage cases across countries, but it's just something to be aware of, that often children and youth are moving from country to country, and just talking with the child or youth as well around what information do they want to convey if they're moving on. And this section also looks at what is your role. So again, there's some case management mapping. What role do you play in it, depending on your profession? If you're a social worker, you might have a very strong role in case management. If you're a youth worker, you might have a different role, or a therapist, a counselor, a police officer. It depends just what your role is, but there's a mapping tool that helps you to understand where you might fit within that system. Then the next part of the training looks at referrals. So it helps you to map out what referral possibilities there are where you're working. There might be very few or there might be many, depending on the community that you're in. But just helps for you to map out and write down, where can I refer children and youth to? Is there a specialized counseling agency? What services and support do they need? who is working in social care, etc. So this part of the training, you will actually do a formal mapping again of any referral sources where you can send children and youth on to. You'll then be taken through a discussion on reporting and mandatory reporting. And again, it comes back a bit to the mapping you'll have done earlier. It's really important to understand in the community that you're working in, what are your mandatory reporting requirements? And by that I mean, if a child or youth discloses gender-based violence, are you required under law to report that either to the police or to social care? So it's important that you have a very good understanding of that, because that very much then influences levels of confidentiality. Some children and youth may say, I want to tell you something, but I don't want you to tell anybody. And you would need to respond to that. If you tell me somebody's hurting you or you're going to be hurting yourself, that there are some mandatory reporting laws, and just to make it very, very clear to children and youth before they're disclosing what potentially happens next. So the next piece of the training, as I said, looks at your care. Hearing difficult stories, working with children and youth can be really challenging, and you may find, especially depending on the community where you're working, maybe there's high levels of need and few resources, and that can be very taxing and very, very stressful. And so it's important that we focus on this module as well, where we look at vicarious trauma and secondary care. And so what this means is, if I'm hearing stories of trauma, I'm not actually experiencing the stories, but they can still impact me. I can still carry those stories. Maybe you find you go home at the end of the day and you're thinking about the stories that you heard and they're really weighing on you. And the symptoms of vicarious trauma start to become feeling hopeless, feeling like you're really tired all the time, you're having a hard time getting to work, maybe hopeless in humanity that these situations have happened and it's very difficult, and just feeling like you don't care as much as you used to, and just having a very difficult time getting the energy to do your job. Some of those can be symptoms of vicarious trauma. And it's also important to look at stress levels of, are your stress levels increasing as a result of doing this type of work? So there's some handouts that we have around how to potentially manage your well-being, how to look at your stress levels, and how to seek support when you need support. Because if you don't look after yourself, you can't go on to look after others. It's absolutely essential that you're caring for yourself. The analogy I always use is, if you imagine that you're a well and there's normally a spring coming in to fill up the well with water, but suddenly the spring gets cut off and people continue to take water out of the well, eventually it runs dry. And our bodies and everything about us is very much like that. If we're not doing things to fill ourselves up, to feel healthy and to feel strong, eventually we could burn out or experience vicarious trauma. So the training then ends with looking at your resilience and you building a resilience plan so that you can continue to support children and youth in the best way possible. So the last piece that we're going to look at is youth facilitator training. So if you imagine we're forming really a holistic model of training. So we're looking at training care professionals, people who might be on the front lines. We're looking on building capacity to train many other people, but we're also looking at building the capacity of the youth themselves. Because too often grown-ups are designing all these programs and taking them forward with very little consultation from youth. So the youth facilitator training was designed, and this is where you can find it, and it was designed with the goal of increasing knowledge amongst youth on gender-based violence. So what we found with some of the youth is that they weren't aware of how to name what was happening to them. So we're wanting to increase the knowledge amongst youth by having youth talk to other youth rather than adults coming in and trying to explain GBV. It's much more effective if youth are talking to peers. They'll be much better heard. Another goal is to empower youth to play an active role in addressing and preventing GBV so they feel empowered within this. Because one of the greatest impacts of GBV is a loss of power and a loss of control. And so we're trying to give youth back this power and back this control. And after the training, the youth are then expected to carry out peer education with their peers. as well as participating in a youth advisory group. So that's the goal of the manual, is to give youth information on gender-based violence so that they can then continue to educate their peers as well as being on advisory groups. And so the objectives of the course are, by the end of it, the youth will have an increased awareness of GBV. They'll have developed skills to lead awareness raising campaigns. So we really want the youth to go on to raise awareness and have activities for other children and youth. The goal of the training is they will be able to understand, identify, and address different forms of GBV. They'll play an active role in preventing it. And again, to be on an advisory group and educate others. And so the modules that are in the training manual, some of them are quite similar to the care professional training manual. So education on who are children and youth on the move, looking at child and young people's rights. And then there's introductions to participation and facilitation. So we're helping the youth to understand how are they actually going to facilitate and introduce participatory methodology when they go to talk to peers. So that's day one, really focus on that, kind of the base of the framework. And then day two is helping them to really think through, okay, I'm going to design a project. I'm going to design an activity. How do I do that in practicality? So how do I listen? How do I find power? How do I be assertive? And then what kind of project do I want to design? And so the key principle that we're looking at is youth participation. So we want youth to be able to actively participate in this project. And as Hart said, sharing decisions which affects one's life and the life of community in which one lives is really the goal of youth participation. And children taking part in and influencing processes, decisions, and activities that affect them in order to achieve greater respect for their rights. So these are two of the fundamental frameworks of this training manual, is that youth are participating in order that they can have agency and advocacy over their own lives and greater respect for their rights and awareness of what those rights might be. And so you'll find this in the manual, and Hart, who we referred to just in that last slide, this is his ladder of participation. And at the bottom of the ladder, I know it's hard to see in the slide, but you can see it in the manual, is that often adults, grown-ups, design programs for youth without actually talking to them. And they'll say, right, you, a group of adolescents, you group of teenagers, here's the program. Off you go, but you don't have any say in it. So that's really the bottom rung. That's not the type of program that we want to replicate. What we want to do is have participatory methodology where youth and grown-ups make decisions together. The youth are supported, but they decide on the activities, they decide on how it's going to be rolled out, and the adults in their lives are working with them, but really supporting them to make these decisions and empower them. And another key principle that we'll be training the youth on is facilitation skills, so that they feel that they can have their voice and they feel empowered to be able to talk in front of groups. And the other principle, as I said, is around their voice. How do they have a voice? Often children and youth on the move have been greatly silenced. They feel they can't talk about what's happening, and they feel that they don't have a voice. So a real goal of this training is to help them find that voice. And the final outcome of the training project is for them to design an activity. And so one of the final activities is called Problem Wall Solution Tree. And the question that they'll be asked to reflect on is, how does society allow gender-based violence against young people to take place, and what needs to change to prevent it? So they'll be asked to look at a problem wall. So what are the problems that are contributing to these issues? What's happening that are creating this wall that is making it difficult to change or prevent issues around gender-based violence? So they'll map out all of the problems. And then they'll be asked, well, what needs to happen to address this? This is their solution tree. So then they'll brainstorm with a tree, imagine leaves on a tree, all of the solutions that they can think of. That maybe it's doing awareness raising in classrooms, talking to children. So they'll be asked to come up with a whole range of solutions. And from there, they'll then be building on the solution. So they'll choose one, then make an action plan. Where will it take place? What do they hope to achieve? In which context? Are they going to go to school, to a community? And what resources will they need? So we're going to then change the solutions into activities and action. And so by the end of the program, the youth should have an action plan and activities that they're hoping to achieve. So that really brings us to the end of all of the materials. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, we say, of just highlighting the key components. And one of the very, very special things about these manuals is they're extremely action-based and they're very, very interactive. The learning isn't being done by somebody just talking at groups. It's being done in a really experiential way by people getting into learning, doing activities that speak to them and helping them to develop the knowledge and awareness and understanding. So we're just going to do one final poll. And which of the materials do you feel will be I've just recognized a spelling mistake. Most helpful for you, not post helpful. So do you feel the online training, the youth facilitator, or the GBV affecting children on the youth on the move manual will be most helpful for you? It's just interesting for us to know which one you would find most helpful. Okay. Okay, so a real kind of a real diversity across. I think with the poll you have to choose one. So I noticed that the numbers are switching around a little bit. But so it looks like the manual that you'll be training other care professionals would be most helpful, and the online training. I don't know how many of you work directly with youth, but those materials are there to help you as well. So what we can do now is open the floor for questions. Please feel free to ask any questions you might have around the materials, around GBV with children and youth on the move. You're able to ask anything that you might
just
like.
To give a few
and
minutes
you
for the people
type them into the chat
have a
box.
reflect on your presentation and to ask questions. I was really impressed by the amount of materials you presented to us today. And I'm really happy that you also tackled the part of secondary trauma, because our experience in working with people and with children is that professionals often forget about taking care of themselves, and there is out problems in all the areas, I think, of professionals who work with children, social workers, psychologists, educational specialists. So I think it's really great to put it also in the online training and training materials. I think it is very important. And also a question for me is, these are really fantastic materials. I'm only worried about not to be forgotten somewhere in the huge area of internet. How do you plan to share this information among professionals in different countries? Do you have any kind of plan? Maybe Nenad has this kind of also information for the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that might be a question for Nina. I think partly what we're starting is kind of a grassroots program, if you want to call it that. So with the partners, just to fill you in on the training of trainers that we've been doing, all of the partners working on the Bridge program came together in Budapest, and so we trained 18 people within the partnership who will now go back to Greece, to Malta, to Romania, and to Belgium, and they will then train others in the materials. So it's starting with a kind of real cascade model. So training one core group who will cascade it out, So that helps to keep it alive as well. Because for me too, we don't want to produce something then sits on the shelf. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly, exactly. And I think what's been wonderful as well has been the translation, so that the online training and the materials are all translated into the languages of the partners, so that there already is materials in other languages. And what's very special about this program as well is the group of partners that we trained originally in the training of trainers are going to come back together in February. And yes, this hardly ever happens in this fantastic
really nice
model of because they will deliver the materials, we'll come back, we'll refine the materials again, look at what needs to happen next. So the longevity and sustainability of this program will hopefully continue on.
I missed the information. I know that you tested during working on it, but how did you test it?
Exactly.
Oh.
Well, maybe how we designed it is the better question. We really tested it last week during the training of trainers around that, what the presentation looks like. But how we designed it was just talking with GBV experts throughout Europe. So for each module, we consulted with people who were experts in that area. So throughout Europe, there's people who specialize in case management. They specialize in taking disclosures from children and working globally as well. So really building into this the best practice materials that we could find and kind of the current thinking, the current expertise has all gone into that.
For the people, just to give us feedback, how interesting and useful was the webinar for them, and maybe there will be then maybe some kind of specific questions. Yes. Yeah, and also in the recording of the materials.
I forgot to click on or to draw attention to the web links as well.
As I understood,
just for everyone, if you look at the web links, if you haven't downloaded the manuals, you can just click on those links as well. That will take you to the
for non-partner countries. Nedad, are you with us?
Yes, indeed. And I wanted to also thank you very much, Karen. I also wanted to provide more input into the question that Vesna had asked initially. But Karen, you have done a great job in addressing practically all the points that I also wanted to mention. With regards to the sharing of these documents, this is something that we will need to check. Although this is not a copyrighted, essentially document, it belongs to Terre, to the Bridge project. But it is a EU-funded product, or a product that has been developed as part of a EU program. So this will be something that we will need to just check to be on the safe side. But I would very much, as the manager of this project and somebody who worked on the development of the proposal, I would very much like to see this document and project outputs be disseminated and replicated and used as much as possible. So I would be happy with this if this would be the case. But this is something that I would encourage for a discussion, or to contact me directly in the aftermath of the webinar to seek whether this indeed can be possible.
Nenad, can you share your email in the chat box, please?
Yes, I can. Yes, of course.
Fantastic. Great.
Yeah, there. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. If there are no questions more, I would like to thank you very much, Karen, for being with us today. It was really interesting.